Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the panel on algorithmic transparency and content amplification. Since the Christchurch attack, there's been an increasing focus on how extremist content can be amplified and promoted by content sharing algorithms. And social media companies face a lot of pressure from legislators to address this issue. There's a knowledge gap in terms of how legislators and those otherwise operating outside of social media companies understand how these algorithms work. So this panel, we're going to discuss some of the issues surrounding these algorithms and the amplification of extremist content online. This panel is not going to follow a standard 3 presentations discussion format. It's more of a conversational thing. So any questions you have, send them along as they occur to you. And after we get to our initial discussion, I'll open up to the floor and we'll take questions from the audience. I'll introduce the speaker that's here so far. Is Dr. Chris Meserole, who is a fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution and a director of research for the Brookings Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Sean. It's a pleasure to join you today.
I'm glad to have you. So I just thought we'd start off like pretty broad and easy question where we'd lay out so how exactly, or an approximation of how the technology, the algorithms behind content amplification works. What are we actually talking about here, you know?
Yeah, well, I first of all, thanks for hosting this discussion, and you know, hopefully we can have a pretty good conversation. I think as far as kind of laying out how the technology works, it's important to kind of back up a little bit and just, you know, one of the motivations for this conversation around algorithmic amplification, especially in the extremism and terrorism space, as you mentioned, kind of came out of, you know, the Christchurch call and the focus. You know, I think Brenton Tarrant was kind of one example of this, but I think there have been many others as well, of folks who have kind of spent a lot of time, you know, I think the hashtag, or like the one way of describing it is just, there's a cohort of violent extremists now who have been very online, so to speak, and their experiences online were pretty formative in terms of adopting both the ideology that they hold and also kind of their willingness to act on it and actually carry out violence. And I think one of the questions that has presented is, what is the actual role of that online ecosystem in leading people towards violent extremism? And one of the big kind of questions in particular is what role do algorithms play? You know, as they increasingly, you know, I think 20 years ago, that might not be the conversation that people were having around, you know, online extremism. It's not like online extremism is not new, like it's been around for quite some time, but the focus on algorithms has really shifted over the last decade or so, really in the last, you know, few years, as algorithms increasingly became, you know, almost inseparable from the web in some sense, in the sense of kind of filtering all the information that's available on the web and presenting it to individuals in a way that's often personalized. And so there's a few different ways that can happen. One would be just basic things like web search, right? If you think of you know, search engines on the web, they're kind of collecting and sorting through, you know, all the information that's publicly available on the web and coming up with algorithmic ways of sharing it with users. By and large, that's, you know, that's one way of finding information. There's a very deliberate signal on behalf of the user who's kind of surfing the web or searching the web for specific kinds of content. In the sense that you generally speaking, if you're searching for something, you already know what you're looking for. The other kind of main algorithm I think that's in question is really, you know, and I think one where a lot of the policy focus has been is on algorithmic amplification in social media and content sharing platforms. You know, platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and how the algorithms that are used to present information to users are influencing, you know, both the beliefs that they come to hold and again, their kind of willingness to act on them. And one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons this has become really salient recently is that there's been a shift in most major online platforms over the last few years from kind of deterministic reverse chronological news feeds. So when Facebook first started its news feed or Twitter started its, it was basically like, whoever you're following, whatever the last piece of information produced by one of, the people you're following is, it would show up at the top of your news feed, and you'd have to check it repeatedly throughout the day, or at a certain interval. And at a certain point, the kind of reverse chronological way of sorting information did not, it wasn't scalable to the size of some of these networks and the information that the networks were now gathering from users. And so they had to increasingly rely on algorithms that were more sophisticated than just kind of reverse chronological order. And increasingly, about 2 or 3 years ago, or I guess maybe even 4 years ago now, the advent of deep learning and the use of deep learning algorithms, which in contrast to previous algorithms where, a software engineer might come up with the rules for, which kinds of posts a certain user might see. With deep learning, you're basically, as a platform, you're taking the data that you have on users. You're taking that data, you're taking the data, both the personal kind of identifying data that they have, and also the data that's been generated by their interactions with the platform. And you're learning from that data in a way that's pretty much completely hands-off from an engineer's perspective. What kinds of content is most likely to interest a given individual at a given point in time. And so the shift that we saw, in around 2017, 2018, was most of the platforms, deep learning and kind of advanced machine learning techniques reached a point of maturity where these platforms could really turn over the algorithm to, a really sophisticated neural network model that could learn user behavior over time. And most of the time they were trying to optimize for some metric of engagement, like likes or shares or retweets. And the way that kind of ties into extremism is that it, in the case of most content, one of the things that the algorithms learned is that the most extreme content will often be the ones that users are most excited to engage in. So it could be, in some ways, that's a very good thing, right? If it's the birth of a child, your niece or nephew, you want to see that content, you're going to engage with that content. It's a really extreme kind of moment in somebody's life. But that's also true for things that generate anger or things that kind of generate really sharp negative emotions too. And it'll kind of increasingly push you towards the most extreme forms of content that you're interested in. And so with extremism, you can start out with fairly anodyne political views or mainstream political views. And over time, it may increasingly kind of push you, we don't know for sure. And that's one of the things we can talk about is kind of what evidence we have to suggest that this is actually happening. But theoretically, one of the things that recommendation algorithms can do is they can show you a little bit more extreme content. If you like that, they'll show you a little bit more extreme content from that. And very soon you're out on the margins of really extremist content and ideologies. And it's something that I don't think affects necessarily the average user, but in some cases, I think there's plausible evidence that it's played a meaningful role in some individuals' pathways towards violent extremism. So I've kind of thrown a lot out there, up front, but that's kind of hopefully a helpful overview of how the algorithms work and what role they might play with extremism itself.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I can see where you touched on a lot of things that I think we'll talk about in this panel. One of which I think is this idea, the development and the increasing sophistication of these algorithms, and how it's kind of tied in with the business model of a lot of these companies, but also on a technological level, they're very hard to explain. Like explainability and transparency is just not technically feasible in a lot of cases. And I think Emma's joined us, and Emma was part of recently wrote a paper, a report on the content analysis algorithms and how they have problems with robustness and data quality and measurability. But I think the ones that we're really concerned with is measurability and explainability. Correct? And Emma, if you've anything to add to that. Hi, by the way. I'll introduce you first. My apologies. So Emma Llanso is the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where she works to promote law and policy that supports internet users' free expression rights in the US, Europe, and worldwide.
Hello, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and deepest apologies for the delay. Chris, I hope you had a fun time just winging it solo on the panel. I'm sure for all the participants it was a great discussion. So I'm kind of apologetic to be interrupting it right now with my late presence. But thank you so much for the invitation to be on this panel. And yes, to just kind of dive right into what I think I'm not sure exactly what you all have covered so far, but as far as the kind of the technology of content amplification, I would say, from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges in talking about this issue is there's a lot we don't know about exactly how these amplification algorithms work. And please stop me if this is something you all have covered already. But in general, I would say that when you're thinking about content amplification algorithms on services like Facebook or search engines, or really any kind of recommendation or ranking algorithm, the way these systems work is they look at a variety of different signals, right? So they are trying to sort through of all of the information that is possible for someone to be looking at in response to a particular query, or just when they open their social media feed and take a look. They will be looking for kind of different ways of measuring what might be interesting or relevant to a person. And these kinds of signals can encompass a lot of different things. A lot of them are metadata signals. They might be signals about, if you're on a social media service, is this content coming from somebody you have a direct connection to on the service, or coming from a group or a brand or some page that you intentionally follow, or is it kind of referred by a friend of a friend, or something less directly tied to you. It might be signals about the time that it was posted. Is it very recently posted, or is this content from 3 months ago? But there's also a whole level that is likely happening on a lot of these different kinds of algorithms about actually trying to analyze the content of them as well, right? And both to do things like try to match them up with interests you have that you've expressed in some way to the social media service, or if you're using a search engine that's trying to personalize search results, things where you've indicated you have looked for this kind of information before, where it may have developed a profile about you. And also just trying to assess what is the subject matter of the particular pieces of content that might be served to you, or links to web pages that might be given to you. And it's particularly this area of content analysis that is, it's its whole own field of machine learning, whole own set of topics about, what are the capabilities of things like natural language processing algorithms to actually understand different kinds of text and written communication. How do different kinds of computer vision techniques work to try to classify what's in an image, or kind of identify what the subject matter of an underlying image or video might look like. So in all of these different pieces, I guess one overarching piece I would say is that when we're talking about content amplification algorithms, we're actually talking about a lot of sort of nested series of automated decisions and automated kind of analytical processes. And so each of these different pieces may be something that needs to be unpacked or needs to be explained in order to really kind of answer the big picture sort of policy question of, why did this service send this kind of content to this person?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think it kind of moves on to our next question with there's often this conflation between content moderation and content amplification, especially in a legislative context. They're treated kind of like the same thing when they're very different. But as you say, there's this background process which affects both. Like content analysis really is required for both. They can't recommend you something unless they know what it is, and they can't moderate something unless they know what it is, right? So these processes play out in both. But I wonder if either you could speak on this problem we have with them kind of conflating the two, the conflating moderation with amplification.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and it's one where I think, especially in our public policy conversations, what exactly content moderation means has kind of shifted and changed over time. So for a long time, I think for a long time, nobody outside a very small niche of nerds was talking about content moderation at all. But the idea was often sort of framed in this sense of, oh, okay, moderation is the decisions companies make about taking down content or leaving it up. And there was this very sort of binary presentation of it. You hear it even in the way we talk about different legal regimes like the DMC, Digital Millennium Copyright Act's notice and takedown regime, right? The idea that if a company gets a notice that something might be violating the law, the response will be take it down. But content moderation, or the ways that companies manage content, or any host of user-generated content manages content, is actually increasingly much more diverse than just a binary take down or leave up decision. There will be any number of kinds of actions that a service will take against a particular piece of content or an account, whether it's to demonetize it, say the content can stay on the service, but the person can no longer make any money off of that content. It might be to downrank it, or what is sometimes called shadow banning, where content gets less distribution, in some cases even is not visible to anyone other than the person who posted it, but it doesn't have that same look and feel of having been fully taken down in a kind of transparent and obvious way from the service. So in a way, I think the use of amplification algorithms or ranking and recommendation systems is a part of the kind of the broadest sense of content moderation, because they're all sort of tools that are involved in how companies manage access to millions or billions of posts of user-generated content. But there are some really key choices that companies are making when they're doing those really specific decisions on particular pieces of content and assessing them against their terms of service and saying, does this content violate our rules and actually need to come down entirely? Does it maybe violate the laws in some countries, but not in our terms of service? So we'll geo-block it to that particular country, or maybe kind of affect the distribution of that content, but not take it down entirely. But Chris, I'm curious what you think on that.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on everything that I would have as well, and I think one thing that might be helpful to touch on is even just kind of walking through what happens with content moderation and amplification. And so there's, if you as a user are uploading a new piece of content, whether it's an image or a video or a piece of text, what will often happen is it first gets kind of filtered against a set of hashed content for content that's known to be kind of, in some cases it's illegal content, right? It could be like content from a terrorist group. It could also be, child sexual abuse material, something that we know is illegal and has to come down. And it'll be screened kind of on its way up, to the service from the user. That's a form of kind of content moderation very early in the kind of pipeline, from when you as a user start to submit something to when I as another user start to see something. That kind of form of content moderation is really about kind of just ban or no ban to some extent, or kind of removing it or allowing it or not allowing it at all on the platform, which is really about kind of just, does this have a right to be published on the web, and does it have can we legally host it on the web versus is it something that we need to take down? There's kind of further along in that pipeline, there's a decision that's, I think, this is a point that Emma made really well about the use of algorithms for kind of classifying different kinds of content, and the way that some of those classifications are then used as features to be measured for what a piece of content, what a given user should see next in a news feed, for example. And that's kind of a form of, you can call that content moderation if you're kind of deliberately calibrating how much visibility you're willing to give that piece of information based on what you think that content actually contains. And so that's a slightly separate version, or a slightly separate kind of, in my view, a slightly separate kind of policy conversation around what kind of reach some of these pieces of content should have, and what the role of platforms and different algorithms should be in moderating that content and allowing it to be shared, and what kind of visibility it should have. One of the reasons I kind of stress the difference too is that on the policy side, there's different implications for what you might want to do with that content. And this kind of gets into something that we might want to talk about as well, where, kind of black and white content moderation decisions around illegal content, for example, are fairly straightforward. Some of the harder conversations around content moderation and amplification have to do with kind of content that could be harmful in some contexts, but it's not necessarily illegal. And trying to understand what's happening with that content requires a certain kind of transparency that goes beyond just the traditional transparency that we get, that policymakers ask for with content moderation, which is, tell us what you're taking down, tell us kind of counts about, how much you removed and how quickly you removed it. For things like the amplification of potentially harmful, content, that's a different set of kind of criteria that we're not really having access to in terms of transparency right now. It comes also, I would say, with a different set of trade-offs with free expression and the, for content that's not illegal but could be harmful, trying to balance that against the need to protect, human rights and free expression is a slightly different trade-off, and requires, I think, a different calibration in terms of policy responses and what kind of transparency we're asking for when it comes to these algorithms. And so that's kind of the one point I would add, I guess, to what Emma said before, which, again, I think she did a really great job of laying out that distinction.
Well, and I mean, just to build on that, if that's okay, one thing I feel like I notice in conversations with policymakers, on both sides of the Atlantic, in the conversations we have within the Christchurch call, really global conversations around terrorist and violent extremist content, is this whole question of the content that is not necessarily illegal, but is still concerning in some way, or that especially governments and policymakers want to see action taken. To me, I see a real blurring of the line between the sort of the freedom that services generally have to set their own content policies and to decide that may be lawful or protected speech that a user wants to post, but the company doesn't have to host it, and they don't want to host it. It violates their terms of service, and so they can take any number of actions against it. A lot of this very point is actually actively under debate in a number of countries, including the United States, about should especially very large companies have that kind of freedom. But in general, and over the past 30 or so years of the public web, they have had the ability to make these kinds of both fine-grained and nuanced, and also, frankly, potentially totally arbitrary decisions about what they do and don't want to host. My perception of some of the public policy debates is that governments have maybe become accustomed to the fact that companies can have that kind of control over speech and can kind of, turn the knobs and dials about what gets amplified and what doesn't, and almost seem to want to take that power, under state control. Some would say to put it under democratic supervision, and others would say to empower governments to go after speech that is admittedly lawful. So I think it's a really interesting thing to kind of pay attention to in all of the public policy debates. These questions about who is acting in what role. Are we talking about voluntary private company decision-making or official state action? What kind of technical intervention is happening? And does it, fully shut someone off from speaking on a platform at all? Is it a decision that kind of proliferates across platforms? Or is it, just something that kind of affects the distribution of a single piece of content? These are all really important decisions. And as Chris said, like the nuances of these really start implicating individuals' human rights. But in some of the policy conversations, those kind of roles between, are we talking about state action on the basis of illegality of the speech or activity that someone's engaged in, or are we really more in this sphere of what some have called the lawful but awful content, content that we can understand people having every interest in restricting its spread, but at the end of the day, it's not actually violating any given law.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I think that you get into murky ground with this idea of when we have clearly that's just lawful speech that we don't like to see. I mean, this is my next question that I was going to ask was, we talk about, the premise was this, like, oh, they're pushing extremist content, they're amplifying it. But then the question there is, well, if it was really that extremist, if it was ISIS propaganda, or if it was like their stormer or whatever, it would get moderated or get taken down pretty quickly. So what content are we actually talking about here that we're saying is being pushed, but we don't want it to be pushed? And then it becomes a political question, which social media companies hate making, or they hate talking about making those decisions. I remember when shadow banning originated on Reddit, I think, and I remember the whole process was that if you posted on a subreddit, the forums on Reddit, the moderator could tell that you were shadow banned, and he had to tell you that you were shadow banned. So you're actually just speaking into the void, which kind of got around the issue of like, you never know if you're shadow banned or not, which I remember being an issue during the Trump presidency. A lot of conservatives on Twitter thought that they were shadow banned with no proof of it, but just because they didn't go viral, they thought, I must be shadow banned. So with these solutions, there's like a paranoia effect because we can't be transparent about it, but then people will always be paranoid because the power exists. But yeah, I wonder if we could have a discussion on, to further this idea of lawful but awful content, and how this can proceed. Like, is this an interminable problem with content amplification and people using the internet?
I can just offer a few thoughts on that. I think the one of the real challenges with lawful but awful content, and I think it might be helpful to use kind of an example from the real world, which was I think it was Michael Flynn a couple of years ago had a tweet saying fear of Muslims is rational, right? And it was the kind of tweet that there was a similar kind of tweets going around at the same time actually in Myanmar by military officials there about Muslims in that country, and in the United States it's hard to argue that I guess you could maybe make an argument that did lead to specific cases of violence, but it's not clear what the effect of Flynn's tweet was, for example, even though I think most folks might recognize that as some form of hate speech. In other cases, there are other places where it has led to real world violence, or that kind of rhetoric has been tied to real world violence. And so there's this question, and I think Emma touched on this a bit too. There's this question of what responsibility do platforms have in kind of moderating the reach of these kind of arguments, or this kind of speech and content, and what kind of responsibilities do states and governments themselves have. I would argue that as a starting point, the government themselves should not be facilitating this kind of content in themselves. But hopefully that's a low bar that we can cross. But beyond that, I think one of the challenges and one of the reasons this has become such a pressing issue is that I think it actually goes back to the way that internet governance kind of was first started with. Some of the audience may know about the Communications Decency Act in the 1990s. Which had this section, it's become a famous section, Section 230, that kind of established that platforms would not be held liable for effectively the content moderation decisions that they were making. Emma's probably more of an expert on this than I am, so I'm going to kind of defer to her if I say any of this wrong. But the point that I think has gotten lost, and especially in my understanding of that law, is that it was designed with the idea that hateful or kind of lawful but awful speech should still be allowed on the web, but that there would actually, if you had a large enough web, and at this point you remember that the web was not kind of centralized in the way that it is now. It was kind of a wild west of different siloed sites, etc. Any one kind of site might have a limited reach and kind of impact on society overall. And what's happened in the kind of last 20 years is you've seen this really extraordinary centralization of the way in which information is shared online, whether that's through web search with Google search, or whether that's through overwhelmingly popular social media apps like Facebook or maybe to a lesser extent Twitter. In terms of how they circulate, the role that they play in circulating information across society. So it's no longer just kind of, the law that was designed with the idea that, lawful but awful speech could exist on the web, but it wouldn't necessarily pose like a stark real world threat if it was kind of, if you let 1,000 flowers bloom and there's a lot of different sites on the web, any one of them probably wouldn't lead to kind of mass, threats to democracy, for example. I'm being a little bit flippant here, obviously. But in the time since, what's changed is that there are these centralized mechanisms by which information is being distributed, including information that we would, categorize as lawful but awful. And the question is, should the state step in and do something about that kind of content? In other words, should there kind of be, in the United States anyway, revisions to Section 230? Or should this be something that the platforms themselves should just do a better job of kind of internalizing different best practices in trying to, both limit the really, awful but lawful content while also respecting the free speech of its users? And I think it's not something that I see like necessarily an easy answer to. And I think folks who kind of, regardless of, which side they take on that debate, if there's a lot of folks who feel like they have, tremendous clarity on that, I think it's hard for me to understand, because it's a really complicated issue, I think, how you want to balance those two considerations. Again, I don't know what the right way forward is. One thing I would say, though, is that I hope we start to see some more movement from platforms in particular around the kind of less on the kind of algorithmic role in content moderation and more on kind of the appeals process and the process for redress for content that is taken down or content that is kind of limited in its visibility. Those algorithmic decisions ideally would be paired with a shift in kind of process decisions and kind of almost like quasi-government, governance decisions by the platforms in terms of the options that users have to appeal, whether their content should have been taken down or whether the content of other, friends or users of a platform should be taken down or limited in some way. And ideally that's where the conversation might start to head. But I think I've said my piece on this, so I'll hand it over to you and Emma.
Great, thank you. And I completely agree that there are no easy answers here. And I really just want to underscore, for all the folks on the line, that we are in a really interesting and exciting era of kind of speech governance right now. We are trying to all collectively figure out a very new kind of way of surveilling and evaluating and monitoring and moderating people's speech in a way that we've really never done before in human history. We've had nation states with laws governing speech for hundreds of years, sure, but we haven't had the kind of application of those laws or any set of standards to so many just totally daily, everyday, banal, speech interactions that millions or billions of people around the planet are having kind of at the same time. So the view into what people are saying and the ability to try to apply a set of standards to all of those speech acts is technically, and also is like a governance matter, a very different thing from how regulation of speech by the state or editorial choices by private companies had really ever been before. So the fact that there's no easy answers, I just want to emphasize, like, that's not a cop-out. It is a true statement because this is a genuinely different kind of problem we're trying to solve. On the whole question of sort of what is getting amplified, I think we're definitely in a phase of this, especially when we're thinking about sort of terrorist propaganda and advocacy for extremist violence online. We're getting more and more to the point where the easier decisions or the easier calls to make are happening already, and are happening in a somewhat coordinated way through things like the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism and the shared hash database that companies, companies who are members of that database can feed into and make sure that when, something like the live streaming of the shootings in the mosques in Christchurch, or any other kind of really sort of horrific and globally reviled documentary piece of terrorist violence like that gets produced, there's actually a mechanism where companies can kind of share information about that and decide how they're going to handle keeping that off of their services across the board. So that's almost, those are horrific events when they happen, they're very difficult events to deal with when they happen because there's often a huge amount of volume and a huge amount of kind of rapidity of people trying to circumvent whatever tools are in place to keep that content off of sites. But there's a mechanism in place, and there's a lot of general agreement about the desire to keep that kind of content from proliferating. To do a really broad summary. but then there are all of these other kinds of content, of speech acts, of things that can be, in some contexts, efforts to perpetuate terrorist violence, and in other contexts that same content is being used in news reporting or academic research or recontextualized and part of somebody's political speech in a way that's not actually advocating terrorism. Those are the much harder decisions, and those, I think, are increasingly the proportion of decisions that companies are facing every day, where they're actually making these calls about, okay, what side of the line does this kind of questionable statement or kind of confusing statement that somebody is saying about this political leader who also 30 years ago was associated with a terrorist group, does that count as something that violates this site's policies against advocating for terrorist violence? And so one of the responses you could see from companies to that is try to make their policies more and more restrictive and more kind of account for more and more of those different kinds of examples where they come to the conclusion, we don't want that on our site, so let's make sure our policies cover that sort of example, that sort of instance. The counteractive force there, though, is that, there are probably many of them, but one that I'm really focused on is that many governments around the world are also getting very savvy to using companies' terms of service as a way to enact their own sort of goals of shaping the public conversation and deciding who gets to have a voice and what opinions can be expressed. So if a company has a really restrictive set of policies, it's that much easier for governments, either through formal programs like referring content through internet referral units, or informally just kind of pretending to be users and flagging content for review, but basically to try to alert companies that, hey, there's content here that violates your terms of service, but to target only proponents of a particular view or speakers from a particular political party, or in some other way to really try to take a heavy hand as a informally acting state actor to shape what's available in different countries on these different services. So I see that as a real tension and something that is definitely being noticed by human rights advocates around the world as, very much this feeling, in this sense at least, that their advocacy, their commentary on things like terrorist and extremist violence, their decisions to call actions of their own governments, supporting extremist violence, those are things that are now getting targeted either with, de-amplification or outright takedown. So that's, just to add a further complication to the conversation, that's one of the things, the lines that I think different services are trying to walk when they craft out what are these content policies and what do and don't we allow, because for every policy a service might have or a procedure in place that they have for content moderation, there will be the intended use cases where it may work to a varying degree, and then there will be a lot of kind of bad actors or people acting not in good faith or with that same set of values trying to use the policies for other ends.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think what got raised there is that there's quite a lot of discretion, and there's quite a lack of transparency around algorithmic amplification or de-amplification. As been touched on already, with content moderation practices, the takedowns, it's very easy to produce reports and say we took down X content for this reason, divided amongst the countries. Most social media companies do that. I'm trying to tie my question here with a question you've got from the audience about what are our sources, or as researchers, what are our sources into looking into how these operations work, how the algorithms work, because they make the very salient point that this is all behind closed doors. Employees aren't really allowed to discuss publicly how the system works. So this leads to a bigger question about transparency and what does transparency mean in this context, and what does it mean for researchers, what does it mean for the public, what does it mean for governments, etc. I don't know who would like to start on that.
Yeah, I think the source of information about this is really kind of, for the most part, what companies make publicly available. I think there's probably two ways of understanding how these companies operate when it comes to algorithmic amplification. One is kind of, very often, especially large platforms, have started publishing, they tend to be fairly generic, but they've started publishing more kind of statements about what kind, even beyond just their terms of service, like they're thinking about how they're formulating policies on a given kind of for a given kind of content, whether that's extremist content or other forms of harmful content. So that's kind of one branch of ways of having some understanding of what the platforms are doing. If you want to understand Facebook, for example, they've got a really fairly comprehensive website at this point that lays out a lot of the policies that they have, even beyond just their terms of service for content moderation that touches on, at least partly on, content amplification. On other sources of kind of how the algorithms work, I would say that we're still very much in the dark. And I think this ties to part of the increasing focus on algorithmic transparency, is that we don't actually have a lot of information about how these algorithms are working beyond, there are some examples of, I think Twitter wrote a blog post when it switched over to deep learning for its newsfeed algorithm, just kind of at a very high level documenting what they had done. And it was useful as a researcher to have a better sense, to know that they've kind of switched over to a fully automated process, but there's still, 1,001 questions we would like to know about what kind of data is, those deep learning algorithms are using. And similarly, for other platforms, a few YouTube researchers at Google kind of released an academic paper on content recommendation on that platform, but you're kind of left as a researcher trying to draw inferences about what the actual architecture is under, you can kind of draw some weak inferences and conclude that maybe if Google researchers were producing this kind of academic work, then maybe this is how they're actually architecting things on the back end. But it's still very opaque from the outside. And so the other option as far as learning about how the algorithms work is there's been some work for platforms that have a public-facing kind of feed, whether that's YouTube or Twitter, and a kind of a corresponding API that makes it relatively easy to try and scrape some of the information on those sites. You can kind of run some rudimentary experiments to figure out if you create a certain kind of user profile, what kind of information you're going to be shown, or what kind of content is going to be recommended to you. And you can start to effectively reverse engineer, at least at a very crude way, how those algorithms might work. But it's a very imprecise way of going about it. And I think we still don't really know all that we would like to know about how these algorithms work. And so one of the, I think, focuses of the algorithmic transparency conversation is really trying to understand what kind of transparency we're really talking about when it comes to these algorithms. And is that just kind of reports about, aggregate information about how these algorithms are used, the way that we kind of have transparency around content moderation, and it's just kind of numbers of pieces of content taken down? Or do we want to have more transparency into the actual operations of different algorithms? And there I would, just one point I would make is that there's actually two different ways of getting more granular transparency. One is to kind of open up the black box of the algorithm, and if you're the state, kind of insist that companies open up their algorithms for kind of independent audits of either the code or the data used in producing those recommendation systems. There's some precedent for that in the financial services sector, where states will kind of be able to carry out audits of like financial algorithms and the way that they condition loans and things like that. The other way of doing kind of transparency auditing or algorithmic auditing would be, you're not actually having access to the underlying data or software itself, but you do have kind of an API to measure, if you give it a certain kind of input, here's the kind of outputs that you're going to get. And that's kind of a version of what's known as black box sampling instead. And there, my own preference, for what it's worth, is as somebody who cares about the kind of freedom, free speech and free expression side of this as well, I would like to see the conversation go more towards, black box sampling, with the reason having to do somewhat with what Emma was talking about before, where, in the US, or kind of other democracies with certain kinds of, legal protections, it's easy to say, open up the algorithm, give us all the data, give us the code. That's not the case for a lot of countries around the world. And I think if we push kind of, for the construction of, really, rigorous kind of white box auditing and white box, algorithmic transparency, we should only do that if we're comfortable with regimes that we're not necessarily fans of, or that aren't democratic or don't share our liberal values, also having access to that same infrastructure. Because once it's built out, other countries, an extreme might be a country like China, which has really taken, algorithmic surveillance to just kind of unprecedented level. But I'm probably more worried about some kind of regimes that are somewhere between fully democratic and fully autocratic. So you can think of regimes, like Turkey, for example, where, it's, any kind of infrastructure that it's not fully autocratic in the way that, China might be, and it doesn't have the kind of capability that China might have. But any kind of architecture that's built by major platforms that operate in Turkey, it has shown that it will try to leverage those for its own ends. And I think we need to really be careful about the kinds of algorithmic auditing we put in place, and the information that can kind of leak to a government like that going forward. So it's there's a lot of nuance and complexity to this conversation as well. But I think it's one that I think there could be potentially a kind of compromise middle ground around black box transparency or sampling as well. But I'd be curious for Emma's take on that too.
Yeah, I think plus one to everything that you were saying there. And, I'd probably add my own government, the United States government, to that list of governments. I don't really want to have like a deep view into everybody's private messages as held by social media companies, but I absolutely agree with your point that whatever the infrastructure is that we build for this kind of auditing inspection, it's got to be robust from day one to the abuses that we can anticipate any number of governments potentially putting it to. And yeah, I think I would just add that when I think about transparency around amplification, I think of at least 3 different kinds of transparency, which I think Chris was also touching on. So there's the idea of transparency reports, right, and the kind of regular production of information from an internet company about how its processes are working. One thing I'll flag about transparency reports is Google started doing the first government demands request transparency report about 10 years ago. And it was only about 3 years ago that Facebook, Google, and Twitter started doing their community service or community guidelines enforcement reports. So this is still a really pretty nascent area, and exactly what these reports should look like, what's the best use of them, what kinds of information do we want to see in them, we should all still think of that as very subject to active debate, and something that could be shifted and changed. We've got some documented experience of what it could look like from different kinds of companies, and everybody approaches it a little bit differently. But to really think about what's the utility of those reports, how is it helpful to inform, for example, journalists or advocates or public policy makers about kind of big picture trends on a given service or the general components of what's going on with the service. But that's very different from the kind of transparency that I want to see, for example, given to users directly when action has been taken against their post. This ties into what Chris was saying earlier about the need for a lot more attention to appeals processes and just that kind of individual user to company dynamic. And when a decision is taken about somebody's content, what information do they have to dispute that decision or to understand why it happened so they can avoid having a penalty in the future? We really don't get much information at all about the role of different kinds of automation given to users as part of that notification. So that's a big area for improvement. And then finally, yes, on this point of sort of researcher access to data, I know there are researchers out there who are doing really interesting things with those first 2 types of transparency, but what everybody wants is access to a much richer data set where they can kind of with a number, there's so many different questions that people have about how these kinds of tools work. What are the, what kinds of disparate impacts do amplification algorithms kind of create and perpetuate across different communities? How do they help, either help or hinder the creation of things like filter bubbles or the proliferation of disinformation? There's so many really rich granular research questions, and most people don't have anything close to the access to the data that they would need that's held by companies to explore those. There are genuine privacy concerns around enabling just wide open access to people's social media information. The Cambridge Analytica case is a great example of that. So I think that's a place where I see a lot of potential benefit in public policy conversations is what are the different kinds of data that could be made available to researchers in different ways, whether it's, what really works well as an open source data set that anyone anywhere could take and use for whatever purpose while still, generally preserving the privacy of the individuals who helped create that data, all the way through to, what's your highly regulated kind of sandbox environment where people who go through a whole lot of vetting and there's a whole lot of control over their ability to export any of this data, but can really get deep in the weeds and test out some really interesting questions and hypotheses about, how these systems work, at the really fundamental level. I think we're going to end up needing a whole spectrum of kind of data availability and access to data, recognizing the different sensitivities and sensitivities of the user data involved. But that's the direction I think we should be going, because we need better information to inform all of these public policy conversations. And right now there's just such an asymmetry between what individual companies have about their own systems and then kind of what the rest of the world has about the information ecosystem, as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's bang on the money. I think it flowed very well into where the last question I wanted to ask, which was, so what do we see as the future of research in this area? I know that presumably from the last era, I think most people would say we need more data, which is 100% true. But is there any particular areas that either of you see as being like kind of potential hot button issues coming forward? Say we got access to data, I think is the preliminary point there.
I think if in terms of kind of we need more data, I think it's really helpful to be kind of clear about whether you're talking about like primary data or kind of aggregate data, right? And I think there's different ways of, this kind of speaks to some of what Emma was talking about. In the research community, I think most researchers want greater access because it's hard to formulate good public policy if you genuinely don't know what's going on. And I think we're in a state now where we know this is an important issue. It's really hard to kind of come up with good policy frameworks for it because we just don't have the kinds of data that we would like to see to really be able to inform good public policy. At the same time, we also, I think want to preserve the privacy of individuals involved. And so I think we need new forms. For me, it's less about the specific kinds of data and more about the kind of, auditing processes that might be set up so that we can kind of balance the need to, the public need for greater understanding of how these algorithms operate in a way that can kind of inform our policy with the individual users, privacy rights and considerations as well. And I think that's something that I see that conversation as one that will take root in the coming months and years, and will probably take some time to really play out effectively. And the other piece of it is any question about kind of algorithmic transparency or algorithmic auditing also begs the question of who should have access, which I think Emma touched on as well. And I think there's an increasing conversation that will happen about what kinds of independent auditing should happen within civil society and the research community versus within potentially different governments and regulatory bodies. And I know that there's a lot of kind of proposals around what that might look like floating around. Again, it's probably not a secret at this point that I'm a little bit skeptical of kind of the government getting too far in the weeds in terms of auditing some of these algorithms directly, but it is, I think, the direction where a lot of the conversation will go. But again, I'd be really curious for Emma's take on this too.
Yes, so I one of the questions that keeps coming up in all of my discussions, especially with other advocates, but also policymakers, is this disparate impact question, right? How are content amplification algorithms putting certain kinds of content in front of certain populations, or suppressing the speech or the information coming from different populations? And we really see it coming up a lot in all of the different parts of the world where there is civil unrest or civil war, where there's a real disagreement between armed sides about who is the violent extremist in a particular conflict. So I think is such. There's this deeply felt sense by so many of us that there are really disparate impacts from how, and that amplification algorithms are driving some of this. But the next step needs to be to document that and to identify whether and how that's actually happening. And I think there's one key piece of understanding all of this, that you're going to have to know sort of a lot more about the users and the groups and the cultures on these different services, and know it, I think, in a different way than, for example, Facebook. Sort of they have collected a ton of data about people, but that's not the same as having like an ethnography of the communities on the service and an understanding at a kind of a more interpersonal level of who are the people who are trying to speak and what are the characteristics that mean their speech is getting suppressed, or that they can't reach an audience, or that they're really effective at reaching the wrong kind of audience. So that's one area. And full disclosure, my undergrad degree was in anthropology, so in a way my answer is always ethnography. But I really do think it would add a lot to these conversations to find ways to have a better sense of like characterizing who are the groups of users that are being affected and in what ways. Being able to do that research without, say, telling Facebook, you need to start collecting kind of race and ethnicity data from every single one of your users so that we have that data point to use in parts of our surveys. That's a really big tension that I'm seeing in research community right now, of some of the data that we don't actually want companies to collect on a kind of data privacy angle is really important information to further the research. So finding ways around that, including with social science, I think would be really, really impactful in our policy discussions generally.
I completely agree. I do think that there's this very interesting question in regards to like, we all want to know how the algorithm works, but then there's two different questions of like, do we want to know how the algorithm works baseline for the aggregate population, and how is it actually recommending content to different groups, and how do we want to know how it works when used by people of particular groups, which is a very different question. Like, are they exploiting the algorithm? Are they is the algorithm like tailoring according to their needs, which are more extremist than the needs that generally do? But unfortunately, we had a bit of a late start, and I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm sorry to any of the people in the Q&A who I couldn't fit into the talk discussion. There was like general flow going on, and if you have any like burning questions, please feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter or whatever. It's completely fine. I'd love to talk to you. But I'd like to thank both of our speakers today for joining me. It was a very interesting discussion. I hope the audience enjoyed. Thank you very much.